The palace was bigger than any building the human janitor had ever seen. Walls shimmered with a strange glow, and the floor was smooth as if polished by the stars themselves. The air smelled faintly metallic, and the light from the tall windows fell like liquid gold. Humans had not been common in this empire for centuries, and he knew most aliens barely noticed them. Yet here he was, quietly sweeping the vast hall while the emperor's court gathered for a meeting. The emperor, a towering figure with skin that shone like silver, laughed loudly. His voice echoed through the hall and bounced off the walls like a drum. "So many clever minds," he said, turning to his scholars and officials. "And yet, not one of you can read this." He pointed at a wall covered with strange symbols. The carvings twisted and turned, forming patterns that made the air seem to hum. The scholars shuffled nervously, whispering among themselves. They bent over their tablets, tried new translations, and muttered words that sounded like nonsense. The emperor laughed again, louder this time. "I will give all my gold," he shouted, his voice shaking the pillars, "to anyone who can translate this wall." Some officials gasped. Gold was valuable beyond imagining in this empire. Temples, cities, and fleets could be bought with that much wealth. And yet, the scholars knew it was impossible. The symbols had been carved thousands of years ago, and their meanings were long lost. The human janitor did not move. He continued sweeping the floor, his mop leaving a trail of clean shine behind him. No one paid him any attention. Humans were only there to clean, not to speak. But as he looked at the wall, something in the symbols felt strangely familiar. His mind traced the lines, comparing the curves, the shapes, the angles. A pattern appeared, one he had not seen for many years. "Ha!" the emperor bellowed. "Even the smallest human here could try, I suppose. But do not waste my time. You are just a janitor." He waved a hand dismissively. The janitor paused, mop in hand, and tilted his head. He said nothing. The court laughed. Aliens of every kind leaned forward, curious to see if the human would say something foolish. Some of them even placed small bets, whispering how quickly the janitor would fail. The emperor leaned back on his throne, confident, and waited for amusement. Minutes passed. The janitor's eyes moved slowly over the symbols, and his brow furrowed. His fingers tapped lightly against his mop handle. The shapes were not magic. They were logic. They were old, yes, but they followed rules. He remembered studying old human text, stories of patterns that survived time, and how meaning could hide in plain sight. What the Empire's smartest minds could not see, he could. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "It is a language, not dead, just forgotten. Broken, but simple enough to understand." One young alien scholar noticed him. You think you can read it?" The voice was sharp, almost cutting. The janitor did not look up. "I do not know yet," he said softly. "But I might." The emperor laughed again. "Very well, human. Speak. Show me your foolishness. Translate what no one else can. I am curious to see how a cleaner interprets wisdom." The janitor stepped closer to the wall, his mop left behind. He ran his hand lightly along the carvings, feeling their grooves. His mind worked like a puzzle. He remembered shapes, he compared them, he listened to the rhythm of the lines. Slowly, a meaning began to appear. He could see that the symbols were telling a story, not a command, not a spell. They were explaining something important, a warning, a message, and a hope that someone might understand. The emperor's eyes narrowed. He expected nonsense. He expected failure. But the janitor did not stumble. He began to speak. "These symbols, they are a message. They speak of a boundary, a protection, and a test. They warn not with anger but with knowledge. They are meant to guide, not to threaten." A hush fell over the hall. Aliens stared at him in disbelief. Some whispered. Some blinked rapidly, unsure if they had heard correctly. The emperor himself leaned forward, curiosity replacing his laughter. "Go on," he said. "Explain. How does a human understand what my scholars cannot?" The janitor continued, slowly, carefully, explaining what he could see. He did not boast. He did not demand reward. He spoke like someone sharing a truth hidden in plain sight. The court listened, leaning closer to catch every word. His voice was quiet but steady, full of confidence born from patience and observation, not power. For the first time that day, the emperor felt the weight of being challenged not by force but by understanding. The human janitor, overlooked and forgotten, was showing him a truth the empire had ignored. Gold, armies, and knowledge could not replace wisdom. And in that moment the emperor laughed less. He listened more. The janitor stepped back, letting the court absorb what he had said. He picked up his mop and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. Yet the hall had changed. The laughter had faded. Curiosity and respect had taken its place. And somewhere deep inside, the Emperor knew that this human, this simple janitor, had already won the greatest victory: attention and the beginning of understanding. The hall was quiet now, but the air still trembled with tension. The alien scholars muttered among themselves, their pride wounded by the janitor's unexpected understanding. Some scribbled notes frantically, trying to match the human's words with their own failed translations. The Emperor, seated on his silver throne, leaned forward, studying the janitor like a rare curiosity. He had laughed at the human earlier, but now he wondered if he had underestimated him. The janitor picked up his mop and continued sweeping, pretending to work, though his mind was focused entirely on the wall. He traced the carvings with his eyes, seeing connections the alien scholars had missed. Shapes repeated in patterns. Curves balanced with straight lines. Symbols that looked meaningless alone gained sense when seen together. It was like listening to music where every note mattered. One of the younger scholars, tall and slender, spoke first. His voice trembled slightly. "Human, you speak of rules in these shapes. How can this be?" He shook his head in disbelief. "We have studied this wall for decades. No one in the Empire has even guessed its meaning." The janitor looked at him calmly. "It is not about power," he said. "It is about attention. These symbols were made to teach. They are careful. They are old but not impossible to read. You are looking at them with pride, not patience." The scholar's eyes widened. Others in the court whispered among themselves. Could a janitor really see what the best minds could not? The Emperor's lips twitched into a small smile, though his eyes remained sharp. He had not yet decided if the human was a lucky guess or truly gifted. "Then show us," the Emperor said, voice firm. "Explain what the wall says. Let us see if your words hold truth." The janitor nodded slightly and stepped closer. He did not touch the wall this time, only studied it with steady eyes. Slowly he began to translate. "This wall speaks of boundaries. It tells of lands that must be respected, not conquered. It tells of knowledge that must be preserved. And it speaks of those who will come after, to learn, to understand, and to carry this wisdom forward." The court gasped. Aliens leaned forward, some exchanging nervous glances. The scholars had never considered that the wall could be a guide, not a record of conquest. "A guide?" one whispered. "We thought it was a challenge, a riddle, a test of strength." The janitor shook his head. "It is not a test of strength. It is a test of understanding. Those who rush with force will fail. Those who watch, listen, and think may succeed." The Emperor's silver eyes narrowed. He had built his empire on power and order, not quiet thought. Yet, in the human's words, he sensed a kind of intelligence he had rarely seen. The Emperor spoke, his voice low and commanding. "And you, human, how do you know this?" The janitor did not bow. He did not raise his head arrogantly either. He spoke plainly. "Because humans remember what others forget. We study the old, the broken, the lost. We learn from it. We compare it. We listen. That is why I can read what you cannot." Murmurs spread through the court. Aliens looked at one another with disbelief and, for some, embarrassment. Their pride had been challenged by someone they considered small and insignificant. The Emperor did not interrupt. He wanted to hear the rest. The janitor continued. "The wall was made to guide, not punish. It was meant to warn, not threaten. It is not about power. It is about knowledge. Those who ignore knowledge, who only seek to rule, will fail. Those who understand will survive and thrive." A hush fell over the hall. Even the younger scholars, the ones who had laughed the hardest, were silent. The truth in the janitor's words was clear. They had approached the wall with arrogance, assuming their titles and knowledge made them superior. But a janitor, an ordinary human, had seen deeper than they had. The Emperor's laughter from before had disappeared. He studied the janitor for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of his mind. Then he leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Finally he spoke, voice quieter than before. "Perhaps I underestimated humans. Perhaps we have forgotten what humility and patience can teach." The janitor nodded slightly, still holding his mop. He said nothing else. His task was done. The court had learned something far greater than any gold or title. Respect had replaced ridicule, and the Emperor's curiosity had replaced boredom. In the days that followed, whispers spread across the palace. Scholars began looking at forgotten symbols differently. The human janitor, once invisible, became a symbol of patience, wisdom, and understanding. Even the Emperor found himself consulting the janitor quietly, asking questions he had never thought to ask before. The janitor never asked for recognition or reward. He continued his work, sweeping and cleaning, quietly observing the empire that had ignored him for so long. Yet his presence had already begun to change the minds of those around him. Humans, he thought quietly as he moved through the halls, are small. But small does not mean powerless. We do not need armies to teach. We do not need gold to prove our worth. Observation, thought, and patience, these are the tools that can change worlds. And in this grand alien palace, the truth of those words was finally visible to all. The court was still silent, and even the Emperor's silver eyes seemed to shine with curiosity. The janitor stepped closer to the wall again, leaving his mop behind. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he ran his fingers along the carved lines, feeling their grooves, their twists, their balance. Each symbol told a story, and slowly he began to see the meaning hidden for centuries. This wall, the janitor said quietly, it is more than decoration. It is a message from the past. It tells of agreements, rules, and warnings. It was meant for those who would come after, to guide them. The Emperor raised an eyebrow. Explain, he commanded. Show me what my scholars have failed to understand. The janitor nodded. He began slowly, translating each symbol into words the court could understand. Here, he said, pointing to a series of curved symbols, it speaks of boundaries. Land that should not be crossed without permission. Places that must be respected. The creators wanted to prevent conflict, not provoke it. A few scholars muttered under their breath. They had thought the wall was a test of power, a challenge to prove who was strongest. Now they realized it was a map of peace, a lesson in wisdom. The janitor continued. Here, he said, moving to a section with sharp, jagged carvings, it warns of danger. Not as punishment but as protection. The message is clear. Those who rush forward without care will fail. Those who listen, observe, and understand will succeed. The court leaned in. Every alien present felt the weight of his words. The janitor was not threatening anyone. He was teaching. And his voice, quiet and calm, carried the authority of someone who understood the language of both the past and the present. The Emperor's voice broke the silence. And how do you know this, human? You have no titles. You have no studies in our schools. You are a janitor. The janitor smiled faintly. Titles and schools cannot teach what patience and observation can. Humans survive by learning from what others ignore. We study ruins, old texts, broken patterns. We listen to what is forgotten. That is why I can understand what your empire could not. Whispers spread through the court. Scholars exchanged nervous glances. Could it be true that a human, overlooked and unseen, had solved a puzzle that had defeated generations of the empire's brightest minds? Some nodded slowly, others remained skeptical. The Emperor said nothing. He simply listened, studying the humans' every movement, every word. Continue, the Emperor finally said. Show us all of it. The janitor's eyes scanned the wall again. The middle section, he said, is a record of knowledge. Not for power, not for ruling, but for learning. It shows the order of things, the cycles of events, the mistakes of the past. Whoever understands this can avoid those mistakes. Whoever ignores it, will repeat them. The court became completely silent. Some scholars clutched their tablets, trying to follow his translation. The janitor's words made sense, simple but powerful. This wall was not a weapon. It was a guide. And the human speaking to them had shown insight no one else had. Finally, the janitor said, the last section is a test. Not of strength or skill but of wisdom. It asks the reader to think, to question, to understand before acting. Those who rush will fail. Those who reflect will succeed. That is the meaning of the wall. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. He had built his empire on power and command. Yet the wall had been created with care, and now, thanks to a human janitor, he could finally see it clearly. He realized the wall had protected his empire for centuries, even while his people ignored it. Silence stretched across the hall. The scholars were humbled. Even the younger officials who had mocked the janitor earlier could not find a word to speak. The truth was undeniable. The human had translated what they could not. The court had laughed, but now they listened in awe. The janitor stepped back slightly, leaving space for the court to absorb what he had said. He picked up his mop but did not leave. He waited, quietly, knowing the moment was not about reward, but recognition of understanding. The Emperor's voice finally broke the quiet. You, human. You have done what we could not. You have translated our history, our warnings, our wisdom. How is this possible? The janitor answered simply, because humans listen. We study what others overlook. We learn from what is lost. That is how we survive. That is how we understand what others cannot. The Emperor stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then for the first time that day he smiled, not a mocking smile but one of respect. The court began to murmur. The scholars were no longer embarrassed, they were amazed. They had learned something more valuable than gold or titles. They had learned that intelligence and patience, not power, could solve even the hardest puzzles. The janitor returned to his sweeping, quietly watching the reactions around him. He had not sought recognition. He had not asked for reward. And yet, in that grand palace, among the most powerful beings in the empire, he had earned something far greater: respect. The emperor, seated on his silver throne, leaned back, considering the janitor. The room had changed. The laughter was gone. Curiosity, humility, and admiration had taken its place. And somewhere deep inside, the emperor knew that this human, small and forgotten, had revealed the greatest lesson of all. Wisdom does not always come from power. The human janitor continued his work, quietly, calmly, as the empire listened, finally learning from what it had ignored for centuries. The emperor sat silently, his silver eyes fixed on the janitor. For a long moment, the room was still, broken only by the quiet swish of the janitor's mop on the polished floor. The court waited, unsure what would happen next. The human had translated the wall, explained its meaning, and revealed knowledge that the most learned scholars had failed to grasp. Yet no one knew why he could do it. The janitor straightened slightly and looked at the emperor. "You ask why a human can understand what your scholars could not," he said. "It is simple. Humans pay attention to what others forget. We study the old, the broken, the lost. We compare patterns, notice repetitions, and think about what is missing. That is how we survive." The emperor leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Survive? Humans are small. Your people have no fleets here. You have no armies to match ours. How can survival give you such understanding?" The janitor smiled faintly. "Strength is not always in power. Humans have always lived among ruins, in forgotten cities, in records that others abandoned. To survive, we learn to listen. We learn to observe. We learn to think. And thinking, even quietly, can reveal more than force ever will." A murmur ran through the court. Scholars glanced at one another, their pride shifting into curiosity. They had always assumed that power and knowledge were measured by titles, fleets, or authority. Now they saw that understanding could come from patience, careful observation, and learning from mistakes. The emperor's voice was low but sharp. "And this translates into reading what our empire has forgotten?" "Yes," the janitor replied. "These symbols were created to guide, not control. They are warnings, lessons, and advice. The empire lost the meaning because it forgot how to look carefully. You sought power, not understanding. Humans, even the smallest and simplest of us, see what others ignore." The young scholar who had mocked the janitor earlier spoke hesitantly. "But how can humans do this so easily? We have studied for generations and yet—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. The janitor looked at him kindly. "You have studied what is known. We study what is hidden. You assume your knowledge is complete. Humans know it is not. That is the difference." The emperor's gaze softened, but his mind was still sharp. "Then what lesson do you teach us, human?" The janitor straightened and spoke clearly. "The lesson is this: value understanding over pride. Seek knowledge, not titles. Observe before you act. Listen before you judge. Respect the past, even what seems small or forgotten. That is the path to wisdom." The court was silent again, but this time it was not tension that filled the room. It was respect. Even the emperor could feel it. His empire had grown powerful through conquest and order, yet this small human, this janitor, had taught a lesson more important than all the armies and gold combined. The emperor asked quietly, almost to himself, "And what do humans gain from this understanding?" "Not gold," the janitor said, shaking his head. "Not praise. We gain survival, knowledge, and the chance to do what others cannot. We see patterns, find solutions, and understand truths that are hidden. That is why we endure even when small." The emperor nodded slowly. He had spent centuries ruling through force, strategy, and control. Yet here, in this moment, he realized that force alone could never teach this. The janitor had shown that the human mind, patient and observant, could accomplish what armies could not. A few scholars spoke quietly among themselves. "We assumed humans were weak," one said. "Yet look at what he has done. He solved what generations of our brightest minds could not." "Yes," another replied. "And he did it without weapons, without authority, without even recognition." The janitor continued to speak, explaining the wall further. He pointed out hidden patterns, connections, and logic that revealed the creator's intention. It was clear that the wall was not meant to be a challenge but a guide. It was protection, knowledge, and a reminder of wisdom. The Emperor finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with weight. You have taught us that humans, even those who seem small, can surpass expectations. Not through power but through thought. Not through armies but through understanding. The janitor nodded, quietly, as if this was exactly what he wanted the Emperor to learn. Yes. And that is why humans endure. We do not rely on force. We rely on our minds. And sometimes that is enough to change the course of an empire. The hall fell silent once more. The Emperor looked at the janitor, and for the first time he truly saw him, not as a janitor, not as a human, but as a thinker, a mind capable of insight the Empire had long forgotten. The janitor returned to his mop, quietly sweeping the polished floors. But the court would remember this day. They had witnessed a lesson in humility, patience, and understanding. A human, small and overlooked, had revealed truths their empire had ignored. The Emperor's final thought was clear. Humans were not the weakest. They were the most unexpected. And that unexpected strength, born from patience and thought, would be something the Empire could not ignore again. The Emperor sat on his silver throne, still staring at the janitor. For a long moment he did not speak. The court had grown quiet, the earlier laughter completely gone. The human had done something remarkable. He had translated the ancient wall, explained its meaning, and taught the Empire a lesson that no army, scholar, or official had ever delivered. Finally the Emperor spoke. I promised all my gold to anyone who could translate this wall. You have done it. All of it is yours. The janitor paused. He had expected the Emperor's offer, but he did not step forward to claim it. Instead he looked around the hall at the scholars, the officials, and the Emperor himself. Gold is not what I need, he said softly. I do not work for riches. I do not need wealth to know the value of knowledge. The Emperor blinked. Not the gold? He asked, astonished. You have earned it. The janitor shook his head. I want understanding, not coins. I want humans to be seen as more than cleaners, more than servants, more than workers. I want knowledge to be shared, not hoarded. That is worth more than gold. A murmur spread through the court. Aliens whispered to each other, trying to understand what the human meant. Some scholars looked ashamed. Some officials nodded slowly, realizing the janitor spoke a truth they had overlooked. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, one not filled with arrogance or mockery but respect. Very well, he said. You shall have what you ask. Humans will no longer be ignored in this empire. Their knowledge, their understanding, their skills, they will be respected. The janitor nodded, satisfied. He picked up his mop again, returning to his work. But something had changed. No longer was he invisible. No longer was he a forgotten human in a vast alien empire. He had become a symbol, a reminder that wisdom and patience mattered more than titles, armies, or wealth. In the following days, humans in the palace noticed the change. Officials spoke to them politely. Scholars sought their opinions. Even the Emperor asked questions privately, seeking the humans' insight on matters he had previously ignored. The janitor did not boast. He continued his duties, quietly guiding others through observation and advice, teaching without words and demonstrating understanding through action. The palace wall, once misunderstood and ignored, was restored. Scholars documented the janitor's translation and shared it across the empire. The message was no longer a mystery or a source of amusement. It became a guide, a lesson in wisdom, and a warning for those who might rely only on power. The Emperor reflected on what had happened. He had offered gold to anyone who could translate the wall, thinking it a joke, thinking no one could do it. Yet the human janitor, the smallest and simplest of beings in the room, had done it. And he had refused the gold. Instead, he had taught the Emperor a greater lesson, that value is not measured in wealth, but in understanding, humility, and the ability to see what others miss. The court began to change too. Scholars no longer acted out of pride or competition. They observed, they listened, and they learned from the humans around them. Knowledge was no longer something to hoard or display. It became a shared treasure respected by all. The janitor returned to his duties, quietly sweeping and cleaning, but he knew the empire would never be the same. The humans were no longer invisible. Their intelligence, their patience, and their insight had left a mark deeper than gold or power ever could. The Emperor watched him one last time that day. You have done more than I could have imagined, he said softly. You have changed the empire without a sword, without an army, without even seeking reward. That is something few can achieve. The janitor simply nodded. He did not seek praise, only understanding. His mind already moved to the next challenge, observing, learning, and quietly teaching those who would listen. And in the Empire, a new respect was born. Humans were no longer seen as small, weak, or insignificant. They were thinkers, observers, and guides. They could solve puzzles that the brightest could not. They could teach lessons that gold could never buy. The palace hall, once filled with laughter and mockery, now echoed with quiet learning. The ancient wall stood as a symbol of wisdom, and the janitor, small and unassuming, stood as a symbol of the greatest human strength, the power to see, understand, and teach even where others could not. And so the janitor swept the hall, quietly, calmly, knowing he had changed the empire forever. Not with force, not with riches, but with understanding, patience, and the simple truth that humans, even the forgotten ones, could achieve the impossible.